Hello there, people of the internet. So, to nobody's surprise, and I'm sure if you've been paying attention to the channel for any real length of time, you probably know that I am a curator of quite a lot of military surplus. Well, as far as practical applications for military surplus goes, there really isn't anything military surplus wise that you would really want to consider for defensive purposes. With some exceptions, there are some exceptions out there that I will go ahead and admit right now, but we're going to go ahead and talk about the previous generation of military surplus firearms. I know a lot of surplus out there. You can get more modern firearms, but we're going to talk about, like I said, the previous generation, pre-self-loading firearms, well, I don't really want to say pre-self-loading firearms because those go back quite a ways. Let's say designed before 1960, not including the AR or the AK. I wouldn't really count those as military surplus just because the vast majority of them out there are sold to the civilian market as opposed to actual militaries. So we're going to go ahead and talk about specifically rifles that are surplused out to the civilian market from military use. Now, as far as practical applications go, the only real practical application for these kinds of rifles is hunting. And I'll be honest, it took me a little while to go ahead and try and narrow this list down because I have a whole lot of different military surplus rifles, and I wanted to do a top 5 military surplus rifles for hunting, but I just could not. So what I'm instead going to do is I'm going to go ahead and do a top 8 list of military surplus rifles. Even then, I feel like that is way too few because there's a lot of really good options out there for military surplus if you're wanting to bring them out and use them on the hunting market. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go from 8 all the way to 1, 8 being it's a good idea for certain reasons, but there's a lot of cons with it, and 1 being this is actually a really good idea. Okay, so number 1 on our list of excellent military surplus rifles to bring hunting with you is an Arisaka, specifically Arisaka chambered in 6.5 Jap, specifically a Type 38. Now, obviously, this one has been sporterized. I recommend if you decide to use military hunting for I recommend if you decide to use military surplus for hunting, you go ahead and find yourself one that's already been sporterized. I do not recommend sporterizing one yourself just because these have become historical relics. But if you find yourself a sporterized Arisaka, they typically run pretty damn cheap, which is definitely a big perk, but the largest downside with the Arisaka is ammo availability and ammo price, so you're definitely going to pay for the ammunition. Now, if you don't know what you're looking at, then these rifles can get a little dangerous just because there are quote-unquote trainer rifles out there which are designed to fire only blanks, which will detonate if you try to fire live ammunition from them. If you don't know what you're looking for with those, then, well, here, take a look at your bolt. If there's no locking lugs on the bolt, then look down the barrel, see if there's any rifling in the barrel. If there's no rifling in the barrel and no locking lugs on the bolt, you have a trainer rifle. Make sure you do not fire live ammunition from that trainer rifle. But that being said, 6.5 Jap is still available out there, although it is quite hard to find, which is why this is my number 8 pick. 6.5 Jap is powerful enough to take on most medium game with an M. Sorry, I have guitar on my mind. And I'm filming this from over in the United States, so 6.5 is powerful enough to take on pretty much everything unless you come across a particularly large bear, in which case shot placement for 6.5 would still be enough to handle it, but I would not recommend trying to fight a bear with a 6.5 Jap Arisaka. But the nice long barrel, the excellently constructed rifle, and these are very nicely constructed rifles, just make sure you're not firing live ammo from a trainer rifle. The cheap price, the lack of recoil from the very nice firing 6.5 Jap round, the extremely long barrel from a non-cut down barrel on one of these Type 38s means excellent sight radius, excellent accuracy. You can touch out to quite a fair distance with this rifle. That 6.5 round also has not a whole lot of drop since it's a relatively light bullet for what it is. and it's not affected by wind very much, so you can touch out to some pretty fair distances with these rifles. 6.5 Jap is still made today, which is why you can still find it, although it is a little bit more on the expensive side. So I would not recommend using this as like a plinking gun, but as a hunter, this right here would make a very decent rifle. I think one of my absolute favorite things about this Type 38 is the fact that the ammunition is just such a pleasure to shoot. The ammo is my favorite and least favorite part about this rifle. 6.5 Jap is just so nice, especially because this rifle, especially when sporterized, is light, so it can be lugged around real easy, but 6.5 Jap is already a pretty light firing round. Now there are much better modern 6.5 cartridges out there that are actually, as of right now, probably about the same price as a 6.5 Jap. But we're talking about military surplus rifles right here. I wanted to go ahead and give the 6.5 Jap at least an honorable mention at slot number 8 in rifles. That would be a good idea. Military surplus rifles, that would be a good idea to take out hunting with you. I also want to point out that the 6.5 Jap has a 5-round internal magazine, so you don't have to worry about having to customize the magazine in order to only hold 5 rounds like you do with some other military surplus rifles. A lot of laws here in the US are, well, they restrict your hunting capacity to 5 rounds inside of your rifle. So that is one thing to consider when looking for military surplus specifically for hunting. I also want to point out that the safety on this thing is right here in the back, a lot like how a Mosin Nagant works, except you push it instead of pull it. But the reason I bring up the safety is because it's nice and quiet to activate. Well, nice and quiet to activate and deactivate. If you have, you know, a target, you know, if you're out hunting and you have a target and you don't want to flip like a loud safety, then one of these right here, nice and quiet, and you probably won't spook off whatever it is that you're taking aim at. Alright, number 7 on our list of excellent military surplus rifles to bring out is the 6.5 Carcano. This particular one has, of course, been sporterized. This is one that I bring out myself. The firing pin in it is currently broken. I actually plan on fixing that. I have a firing pin sitting right over there. But this is a nice, lightweight rifle. A lot like the 6.5 Jap, though, this ammunition can be hard to find, but 6.5 Carcano is way easier to find and way cheaper than 6.5 Jap. As a matter of fact, 6.5 Carcano matches up to the same price as a lot of other modern cartridges out there. So the price of the cartridge isn't really, I mean, it is something to consider, but it's not something outlandish like the 6.5 Jap is. Like, these right here normally run around $1 to $1.25 a round, depending on what you're getting, depending on how much of it is available on the market, but that is roughly what a 6.5 Creedmoor runs, especially right now. 6.5 Carcano is powerful enough to handle anything in the Americas, which is exactly where I'm filming this at. I wouldn't recommend going after a rhino or an elephant or anything with this gun, but sporterized Carcano, these are nice and lightweight. These rifles are also exceptionally cheap. I think I paid like $130 for this rifle in like modern times. The Carcanos have been recently surplused into the country as well, so you can find these quite easily for not a lot of money. Now, if you find yourself a sporterized one, great. That'd be perfect for hunting. But the beauty about these Carcanos, especially if you're getting yourself a carbine version of the Carcano, is they're already quite small and quite light. I mean, as you can see, I'm lugging this thing around absolutely no problem. Obviously, the sporterized one is just a hair lighter, but this Troop Special model is quite light as well. I would have absolutely no trouble taking a non-sporterized Carcano out into the field. Now, despite how lightweight they are, they fire a 6.5 round, and it fires a particularly light projectile at a particularly low velocity, still enough to handle whatever job it is that you're trying to do. But combine all those factors together and you still have a pretty light recoiling gun, especially if you find yourself a sporterized one that has a rubber butt pad on it. This one has metal, but if you get yourself a rubber one, then man, these things are absolutely, like, phenomenal to fire. The reason I put the Carcano above the 6.5 Jap is because Carcano ammunition is cheaper, more readily available, easier to find. Not only that, but Carcano rifles typically run a little bit less expensive than the Arisakas do. Now there's a lot of downsides with wanting to bring out a Carcano for hunting. The biggest downside, these shoot pretty high depending on where it is that, or the distance that you're wanting to fire at. Now if you don't know how to use the sights like a Carcano, however it is you want to pronounce it, I'm sure some people are having their jimmies rustled. But the standard fixed battle sights, if you take the front sight up here, just if you line the top of that front sight up with the wings of this rear sight, you have a 400-yard zero. But if you lower the tip of that front sight all the way down to the very bottom notch of this rear sight, you have a 200-yard zero. I recommend using the 200-yard zero for hunting, just because these rifles right here use a gain twist barrel and they're not really suited for touching out to past 300 yards, simply because these barrels used to be a lot longer. They got circumcised, meaning they snipped the tip of the barrel off, and as a result the bullets don't quite stabilize as well as they should. Once you get to about 300 yards, the bullets start destabilizing and accuracy becomes sketchy at best. Honestly, I wouldn't recommend firing past 200 yards with one of these things, especially if you're looking for an ethical shot. But if you're in an environment like I am, and you know the farthest you're going to be hitting something at is 50 yards, then this right here would make a fantastic option. Now the safety on these, also quite quiet, just like the Jap, simply because there's not a switch or anything. It's simply push and you fight against a spring in order to raise and lower your safety into the safe and firing positions. The one thing I really don't like about these rifles is they take an in-block clip which holds 6 rounds standard capacity. You can find 5-round clips out there, but they're expensive, they're hard to find. So if you take this hunting, if you are in a place that requires 5 rounds or less into your rifle, then guess what? You can't bring a clip, you have to single load this rifle. Not the end of the world, but something to take note for. So I recommend, if you decide to use this, get yourself a 5-round clip, and it will save you a lot of hassle. But remember, if you decide to use all 5 rounds on whatever it is that you're out there doing, make sure you don't lose your clip, because those fall out of the bottom of the gun and you don't want to lose it. I tell you what, I really do like this sporterized Carcano. Normally I'm not a fan of sporterized rifles, simply because I enjoy military surplus, because it's military surplus. But every now and then, whenever I just find a screaming deal on a sporterized rifle, I'll pick it up. This particular rifle is a 1917 Tourney. I believe I pronounced that properly. It used to be 1891, obviously it's been cut down a little bit. The straight bolt handle is a very clear example of, you know, it used to be a 1891. I love how shiny the bolt handle still is, though. Yeah, it's a primitive way of thinking, but I do like it. I need to mount another sling swivel up here. I have one on the stock down there, but I need one up here so I can actually mount a sling to this thing. Alright, at this point I'm just kind of rambling. Sorry guys. Moving on. Alright, number 6. This right here is my number 6 pick in terms of military surplus rifles for hunting. That is your Mauser rifle. Specifically your Mauser Model 98 rifles. There's plenty of other types of Mausers out there, but these right here are by far the strongest and the most common. If you're looking for a military surplus rifle, most of them are going to be either 8mm or 7mm. Nowadays, most of them are going to be 8mm in terms of military surplus Mausers. You can occasionally find them in 308, but bottom line, these Mausers fire a full power cartridge, and they are very, very accurate. They hold 5 rounds inside their magazine. These right here are an excellent choice for using for hunting purposes. The full power cartridge is powerful enough to touch out to, you know, quite a fair distance if you are able to see that far away. And they're powerful enough to take out pretty much anything that walks on this earth, especially with proper shot placement. The Mauser action is incredibly strong, so you can fire some relatively hot loads out of these old school rifles. The only reason that this right here is number 6 is because the Mauser does have a couple of downfalls. 8mm Mauser ammunition is a little bit on the difficult side to find over here in the United States in terms of hunting loads, and whenever you do find it, it can be quite expensive. There's a lot of military surplus ammo out there for 8mm Mausers that you can find, but that ammo is oftentimes sketchy. It's either, you know, extremely hot, or duds, or hang fires, or things like that. 8mm Mauser can just be a little bit of a headache to get to run reliably. You got to figure out what ammo is good, what ammo is not good, what ammo works in your rifle. You got to find a good supplier for hunting ammo whenever you feel like taking this thing out hunting. If you have any sort of problems out there in the field, the bolt can be a little bit on the difficult side to disassemble, especially if you're weak, simply because you got to press against the firing pin spring in order to take it apart. The safeties can be sketchy on these. A lot of times they will work, but there's a lot of Mausers out there where the safeties are quite stiff, and you got to really force that thing. And if you have an opportunity to take a shot, you don't want to have to, you know, force your safety out of battery. That's a great way to make a lot of noise. Like, for example, this Turkish Mauser right here, this safety on this is quite stiff, and it takes a lot of effort. Now, if you're rocking one of the older Mausers, you want to pay attention to the diameter of the bullets. Like, there's a lot of different factors with these Mausers. Pay attention to what it is that you, in particular, are getting, and the ammunition that that particular rifle is designed to fire. You certainly don't want to get oversized bullets and try to run them through your Mauser and get hot gas in your face because you had overpressure and case rupture. Now, I myself am not that big of a fan of 8mm Mauser simply because the ammunition is very sketchy unless you're paying, you know, an out-of-pocket premium for it. I'm already not that accurate with rifles, and 8mm Mauser, especially this old Turkish Mauser, they just don't seem to hit quite where I want them to. Like, you really got to play with your 8mm. Now, there's a lot of good rifles out there, like your Yugo rifles, your Czech rifles, your Kar 98s. I actually have a Kar 98 that's been sporterized. That rifle hits pretty much spot on. But there's a lot of pretty sketchy surplus Mausers out there that you have to kind of fool around with before you can really figure out where your point of aim is. Like, for example, this one right here, I do not know why, but whenever I aim down the sights and I pull the trigger, this thing shoots exceptionally low. What I'll do whenever I shoot this thing is I'll actually take the front sight, and instead of using the rear sight at all, which is just the tiniest little V-notch that I can't even really see my front sight through, I will actually use the little bulges that the leaf sight mounts onto, and I'll use that as my aiming point. This way I actually get, it's still quite low, but I actually get a decent aiming point. Even if I raise this rear sight to, you know, a fair distance, that tiny little V-notch is just very difficult for me to aim through. I mean, Mausers are an excellent option, very versatile, very numerous. They're quite inexpensive if you're getting a non-collector's Mauser. You'd probably find yourself one for about $400, but at that price point, you can get yourself a modern scoped rifle for probably around that same point, and it's probably going to be better suited for your needs than the Mauser. Not only that, but you'll probably be able to find ammunition for that modern rifle a lot easier than you'll be able to find 8mm hunting ammunition for your Mauser. The biggest downside for these rifles, I would say, especially if you're getting a full-size one like this, they're heavy. Not a lot of recoil because they are heavy, but if you get a smaller carbine version like the Kar 98, those do have a little bit more recoil behind them firing that full power round. Combine that with the safeties on these not being consistently good, and those are like the biggest downsides of a Mauser rifle. But besides that, excellent rifles, extremely strong. The 8mm Mauser round, very powerful, can take out anything. Very accurate rifles, assuming that you're getting one that fires at point of aim. They also have a 5-round mag. It can be loaded from stripper clips, so you can go ahead and load real quick if you find yourself, you know, in a herd of pigs or something and you're just taking them out all over. I've heard plenty of stories about people doing exactly that, but that's one of the biggest reasons why I like hunting with military surplus, just because they have the stripper clips, and in a pinch you can load it real quick from a stripper clip. Alright, moving on. Okay, this right here is my number 5 pick. This is where I was actually going to start the video at. Since I'm over here in the United States, this right here is what I would personally pick. This right here is a sporterized 1917. Obviously, it's been cut down a little bit. I recommend, if you're going with the old school bolt-action military surplus rifles from the United States, you find yourself a sporterized one, simply because they are a lot lighter. The full-length, full-sized, full military versions of these rifles are quite heavy. Now, if you choose to go with, you know, an 03, an 06, a Krag, whatever it is that you decide to pick, you can't go wrong. The 03, 06, those are good rifles. I recommend using the 06. Actually, I recommend using any of the rifles that are chambered in 30-06 just because 30-06 is such a popular round here in the United States, and it can be very, very easily found. The reason why I decided to go with the 1917 as opposed to the 1906, A, I actually have a 1917 to show off for this video, but B, and more importantly, these right here are a lot less expensive than the highly collectible, highly sought-out 1906 Springfield. I do not know why the 1917s are a lot less collectible, especially considering that, if memory serves, these right here were actually more prolific. There were more of these made than the Springfield rifles. I believe that just pop culture in general and like video games and things like that, and movies and other various media platforms have just, you know, glorified the 1906 and left the 1917 Enfield out of the equation. But this right here is obviously a sporterized rifle, chambered in 30-06. These right here are extremely nice, extremely high quality rifles. In this particular case, I just kind of have a Ruger rear sight on this thing so I can line it up with the front sight. I would mount a scope on this thing, but whoever drilled the scope holes had a little too much to drink the night before. So they are quite off. There's no way I'd be able to zero scope on that, so I just threw some iron sights on it. The machine work on these rifles is absolutely immaculate, to the point to where I can feel the suction of the locking lugs. I can actually feel the vacuum created by the locking lugs as I open up the bolt. Now these are a cock-on close action, so they're also quite a fast action as well, as opposed to your Mauser actions, which are a cock-on open. If you have a stuck case, you're also going to be fighting spring tension in order to pull that case out. These right here are a little harder to close because you're fighting spring tension to close it, but I rather fight spring tension upon closing rather than opening. Now 30-06 is extremely powerful. It is a one of your more powerful full power cartridge rifle rounds that can be found here in the United States. With just how much U.S. military surplus there is out there chambered in 30-06, that is one of the main reasons why 30-06 is so enormously popular nowadays. Now this 1917, despite being sporterized, can still be fed by stripper clips, which is one of the main things that I really like about this rifle. The safety on these is not a particularly loud safety, but it's not a particularly quiet safety either. You're out there in the field and you got yourself your sights lined up. You actually have to break your firing grip in order to reliably get this safety to go, unless you want to do it quite loudly. That is the big issue with this rifle. The safety, it can be done with one hand still in the firing position, but it can be noisy unless you have like a considerable amount of skill doing it. So the powerful round, 5-round mag, cock-on close action, the safety that is actually okay, and a decent price point for these particular 1917 rifles is why I decided to go ahead and put this at my number 5 pick for this list. Alright, this right here is my number 4 pick. Not necessarily this rifle in particular, but pretty much any of your old school 303 rifles. As a matter of fact, instead of breaking out a number 1 Mark III, I'd probably look for number 4. Where's my number 4 at? Here we go. This right here is probably what I'd pick as my number 4 pick. I'd pick a number 4 as my number 4. 303 can be very readily available, but in times of shortage it can be quite expensive and quite difficult to find. Hunting ammunition for these is about the same as what you would expect with other rifles. Most of your military surplus rounds are going to be full metal jacket, although soft point rounds do exist for these rifles. Now, much like your 1917, these right here are a cock-on close action. They are a rear locking system, which is considered to be less accurate than your front locking systems, such as the Mauser. But if you have, it is probably still more accurate than what you are capable of pulling off, unless you are an exceptionally skilled marksman. Now the biggest downside for the 303 rounds, like I said, as of right now, they're difficult to find and quite expensive, but I have seen them, you know, quite cheap, quite readily available. It all depends on the market. I've seen them as expensive as $3.50 a round. I've seen them as cheap as 60 cents a round. The safeties on these, nice and quiet, because they're just the way the safeties are designed. There's nothing to click. All it does is just pull a piece in the trigger mechanism out of the way. Of course, you do have to break your firing grip whenever you want to engage or disengage the safety, so that is something to remember. A lot of these Enfield rifles have aperture sights, which is actually the type of sight that I prefer, so if aperture sight is your go-to, that would definitely be a good way to go. Your number one rifles actually have a leaf sight on them. The aperture sight does have a far longer sight radius in comparison to the number one, so you do have better accuracy with these rifles just because of the sight radius, if you know how to properly use aperture sights. Now, 10-round mags on these things, you will have to get yourself either an aftermarket magazine or some sort of stop for your magazine to go ahead and make sure it only holds 5 rounds. This way you can legally go out and hunt with it. These rifles also feed from stripper clip, but since it's a rimmed cartridge, the stripper clips are annoying and tedious, and they are difficult to use. At that point, you're basically better off just single loading the rifle. Since they are a double stack magazine and they are rimmed cartridges, you also have to pay attention to how it is that you're loading the cartridges, otherwise you're going to suffer from rim lock. Last thing you want is to be out in the field being attacked by a bear and have rim lock in your rifle and you get your face eaten. You definitely don't want that. Now, if you do decide to go with a 303 rifle, there's definitely worse picks out there. The 303 is powerful enough. It's a full power round. It can basically handle anything over here in the Americas. But I would recommend not going with a full military setup rifle just because these things can be quite heavy. Where's my other one? I have over here, not an actual jungle carbine. This right here is a Santa Fe conversion from a number one. These are quite inexpensive. I think I paid like 250 bucks for this thing. Quite accurate. They have an aperture sight on these as well. These also feed from stripper clip. They are chambered in the 303 cartridge as well. They are rimmed, so just like with the number 4, you got to make sure you're loading these properly into the magazine. What I normally do is I'll stick in like a piece of wood or something inside of these magazines just to go ahead and make it to where the capacity, the maximum capacity of the magazine is only 5 rounds. Now, since this right here is just a look-like, I don't really feel bad about scratching this gun up. So if you decide to go with a 303 Enfield rifle, see if you can find one that's sporterized so you aren't out there beating up a historical relic. This right here, especially with the muzzle brake on it, is actually quite the delightful rifle to shoot. I got a rubber butt pad back here too, so despite the fact that this rifle is a lot lighter than the number 4 or basically any of the non-sporterized Enfields out there, this right here is actually quite the comfortable rifle to shoot. And I do want to point out that unlike Mausers, you can recock your rifle here. So if you are in a situation where, let's say you tried firing a round and for whatever reason your round didn't go off and maybe your game is still standing over there and it just doesn't care that you just tried to murder it, rather than having to cycle your bolt, which could be quite noisy, if the dry firing of your rifle didn't set it off, you can go ahead and just recock your rifle and hopefully the whatever it is still standing there and it will be on the dinner table. Alright, British Enfield rifles. It is a good way to go. Not the best, not the worst. I'm not sure if I called the Enfield rifles number 4 or number 3 on the list. They are number 4 on the list, not number 3. Let me show you number 3. This right here is probably one of the more popular military surplus rifles out there for hunting, just because of how popular they are. This is the Mosin Nagant. Now the 7.62x54 rimmed is quite available out there. It can be found readily, it can be found easily, it can be found cheaply. The ammunition for these things is very available. It's also powerful enough to handle basically anything. The Mosin Nagants also load from a stripper clip, 5-round magazine, so you don't have to do any sort of adjustments. If you get yourself a decent stripper clip for the Mosins, they can actually be pretty smooth to load. Since they're a single stack magazine and do have a magazine cutoff, you don't really have to pay attention to how you load the rounds in. Rim lock isn't really a problem with these rifles. Now, there's plenty of sporterized Mosins out there. If you decide to go out hunting with one, I recommend you find a Mosin that has already been sporterized. If you are bound and determined to get yourself a Mosin for hunting purposes and you want specifically a military version of the rifle, I recommend getting yourself a carbine version such as the M44. Now, you will have to remove the bayonet in certain places. A lot of these... And what are you? Get off my gun. A lot of these hunting lands, especially like the public areas, they don't let you go out hunting with rifles that have bayonets on them. So one thing to consider, the bayonets are not particularly difficult to remove off these rifles, so just keep that in mind. Also keep in mind that with these rifles, firing the 54 rim from them, you definitely want hearing protection, especially if you're firing a carbine version, just because the concussive blast is enough to shake the teeth in your skull. The Mosins are a cock-on open action, and the safeties on them are also nice and quiet. They can be a little difficult to use just because of the spring tension that you're fighting. But the beauty about this type of safety, and all it is you just pull the cocking piece back to your back and you rotate it slightly. The beauty about this kind of safety is just not a whole lot that can go wrong with it. With other safeties, you could accidentally knock it off a safe. With this one, good luck knocking that off safe. Now, whenever you're ready to go, you just kind of turn that and you are ready to fire. It's a very strong, very good safety. It actually, I mean, what it does is it just holds the actual cocking piece back, and there's not a whole lot that can go wrong with it. Now, 54 rimmed can be a little bit of a powerful round, and it does kick pretty hard. So if you decide to get one for hunting, I recommend getting a sporterized one that has a butt pad on it. Otherwise, if you're doing any real amounts of shooting that day, you're probably going to go home with a sore shoulder. The sights on these are pretty good. The V-notch on the back is actually pretty easy to see from. Now, these do go out to 2,000 yards. I don't recommend shooting at something at 2,000 yards. Honestly, I never recommend shooting at something beyond like 300 yards with iron sights, or beyond like 600 with a scope, just for ethical reasons. But these rifles are quite numerous, especially if you're getting yourself a sporterized one. They can be quite cheap. The 5-round mag keeps it legal. They're super easy to use, super simple. Taking them apart, disassembling them if you have any sort of problems out there on the field, also quite simple. Ammunition for them is exceptionally easy to find, especially because it's still not only made, but it's still used in military, still surplus. You can find ammunition for these rifles very easily. That includes hunting ammo, just because of how popular these rifles are for hunting. Now, the beauty about these rifles is, I know that it's not really a beauty. Well, it could be a beauty if you look at it from a certain point of view, but a lot of these old Mosins are already beat up and scratched up and dinged up and things like that, so you don't really have to worry about, you know, trudging through the mud and the dirt and the branches and thorns, and you don't have to worry about getting blood or rust or water or anything on these rifles. They're extremely durable rifles, and they have definitely seen worse. I guarantee it. So that right there is actually my number 3 pick of military surplus rifles to use for hunting. If you had to pick just one hunting rifle and you didn't want a self-loader, that right there would be an excellent way to go. The Mosin, it will outlast you, and that is a guarantee. Alright, this right here is my number 2 pick for military surplus rifles that you would use for hunting. This right is the M1 Garand, or Garand, however it is you feel like pronouncing that. Obviously, these rifles are a little bit more on the expensive side nowadays. You definitely don't want to take one out in as nice of a shape as this one is. You don't want to take it out and scratch it up, ding it up, get it wet, let the wood swell. If you have yourself a good one like this one, I would not recommend taking it out, just because these right here are extremely desirable rifles. Now, let's say you have one from 1949, right? And it's been beat up, scratched up, dinged up, nicked up, and it's not a collectible because it's not used in any real specific war. or wasn't created during any specific war. It probably was used in various wars and conflicts. But if you have one that it's not in pristine shape, then you can go ahead and feel free to take that thing out hunting. The only issue with M1 Garands for hunting is they have to be set up properly, otherwise you're going to damage your operating rod. You need an adjustable gas system inside of your rifle in order to get them firing ammunition comfortably. Now, I do not recommend firing any 30-06 that is heavier than 180 grain rounds from the M1 Garand, just because that might cause issues inside of your rifle. I recommend 150 grain soft points for these rifles. They are quite ammo specific, especially if you want to not only keep them reliable, but if you want them to continue to work for long periods of time down the road. Now, standard capacity in these guys is 8 rounds. They do feed from an in-block clip, so if you don't have that in-block clip, then basically you have a single-shot rifle. And for most places, you will need to get a custom M1 Garand clip chambered to hold only 5 rounds as opposed to the 8 that the M1 Garand is actually designed to run. Safety on these, not a whole lot that can go wrong with these ones either, simply because down here, the trigger guard, you'd have to get something inside of there and forcefully get that safety off of safe. The odds of you managing to do that are not very good. You'd have to really be rough with your rifle in order to knock this safety off into the firing position. The M1 Garand safety is also quite loud because it is quite stiff, so it's not something that I would recommend being forceful with, especially if you have something that you're trying to hide from. Now, why did I pick this as my number 2 with so many downsides? The 30-06 round, again, is extremely powerful and extremely capable. Not only that, but unlike the other options that I've given so far, this right here is a semi-automatic. That means you have some pretty quick follow-up shots with this thing. So let's say you fire a round, your thing starts running because you missed. Guess what? You can fire another round without breaking your line of sight on the target. You don't have to cycle anything. The gun takes care of everything for you. All you have to do is aim at that thing, pull the trigger again. Semi-automatic will always beat out a bolt action in terms of speed and capabilities, just because this rifle right here is a semi-automatic is exactly why I decided to pick the M1 Garand as my second pick for this list. Now, of course, this list is completely opinionated. There's people out there who think this rifle is like the absolute best thing out there for every situation, be it defensive, be it hunting, be it, I mean, they think it is the ultimate universal rifle. Well, for me, there's one particular rifle that I think is just a little bit better than this M1 Garand right here in terms of practical applications. Personally, I would way prefer the M1 Garand over this rifle, but I feel like this other military surplus rifle is just more practical in every single aspect. So this right here is my number 2. Let me go grab the number 1. Let me know if you managed to guess what the number 1 pick is. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, this right here is the number 1 pick. It is also a Russian rifle. It is your SKS. Now, let me know if you managed to, guess that this was my number 1 pick. The reason the SKS is my number 1 go-to in terms of hunting rifles, well, I don't necessarily mean my number 1 go-to, because my number 1 go-to is the Oviedo Mauser that I have decked out specifically for hunting. But the reason why I think this right here would be the best choice as a hunting rifle if you only wanted one rifle is, first of all, it's semi-automatic. So that automatically puts it above most of the other bolt actions that are out there in terms of speed and capabilities. It is stripper clip fed. These hold 10 rounds, so you will have to have an adapter in order to bump these down to 5 rounds. You can find 5-round SKS stripper clips out there. I actually have a video on me using 5-round SKS stripper clips specifically with this particular SKS. But these things are extraordinarily accurate. They fire 7.62 by 39 round, which is quite powerful, definitely powerful enough to pick out larger medium gain, which is what you're going to find mostly here in the Americas, unless you're going after elk or moose or something that is quite sizable. Even then, the 7.62 by 39 is still definitely capable of taking those things out with proper shot placement. Now, I would not recommend trying to hit something with these out, beyond 400 yards, but if you are hunting at that distance, I would recommend firing a full power cartridge anyway, simply because the ballistics of the 7.62x39 cause a lot of bullet drop. So, something to keep in mind. Now these rifles here, semi-automatics, if you find yourself a sporterized one, then they run roughly $250 to $300. This right here is a very gorgeous Russian one, which is one of the more collectible ones. And it is, of course, in its original military configuration, minus the bayonet, which I purposefully took off. Even then, this rifle is not too terribly heavy. A lot of your sporterized SKSs are going to have like polymer stocks, so they're nice and light. They're not overly expensive. You don't have to worry about dinging them or busting them up, or you don't have to worry about scratching them or getting them wet or anything like that. The SKS is quite the reliable gun. Unless you're like trudging through the trenches of World War I, then you're not really going to have any issues with functionality with these things. The 7.62x39 is an extremely popular round. It's what the AK-47 fires, so you can very easily and very cheaply find ammunition for this thing. In terms of military surplus, if you could only have one rifle to rule them all for a hunting rifle, I'd say the SKS would probably be it, depending on where you live. If you live out there in like the great open plains where you can take a shot at 1,000 yards, and that's something that you do normally, and you're an excellent marksman and you have a great rifle that has a great scope on it, then the SKS would probably not be a good hunting rifle for you. But here in Florida, where, you know, your farthest shot's going to be 50 yards, this right here would be an excellent rifle. The SKS is definitely my top pick for capable hunting rifles. I would not bring this one out just because it is in such beautiful shape. It's a collectible Russian one. The redwood on this is absolutely immaculate. This is one of those guns that I'm like careful not to scratch just because of how gorgeous of shape it is in. Okay, well, I think I've covered basically the list that I wanted to cover. If you have any different opinions, which I'm certain that you do, this entire video is entirely opinion-based, and all I did was share my opinions. This is my opinionated list of good military surplus rifles that I think would be absolutely excellent for hunting applications. If your list is different, then hey, by all means, let me know down below. People tend to have no problems at all letting me know that they 100% disagree with me. If you have a particular military surplus rifle that you think is just the bee's knees for hunting, let me know about that down below as well. Now, just with how much military surplus there is out there, and how many different calibers there are, and how many various choices there are out there, of course, this right here is a very incomplete list. I had to narrow it down. 10 was too much, 5 was too little, so I just met in the middle at 8. So that's kind of how I made this list come to be. Over here in the Americas, the rifles I showed you can get ammo for them. There's plenty of other military surplus out there that you can't find any ammunition for unless you like load it yourself. I'm sure a lot of those rifles would also make excellent hunting rifles, but because of the lack of ammo availability is why I did not include some of those rifles in my top picks. Well, if you like videos like this, subscribe to the channel, because I would like to see this channel grow, and every subscription definitely helps. If you like the video, do me a favor, actually like the video. Down in the description, you're going to find a bunch of links to Patreon, Discord, gaming channel, other things, I'm sure. Okay, well, I think I'm going to go grab a bite to eat and a shot of whiskey, and I'm going to settle in for the day. Today was a lot of fun. I wanted to make this top military surplus rifles for hunting. I wanted to make this list for quite some time, but I just never got around to it because I knew that this right here would be a pretty epic long video. So, yeah. Okay, well, I hope you folks enjoyed, because I know I certainly enjoyed doing this. This was actually a really good time. That being said, thanks for watching. Go off. Have a fantastic day.
I've done this. Bonnie and Clyde be damned. Poor man's Garand. It's a shame that bolt-action shotguns aren't more mainstream.